All right. Welcome everyone to the first episode of Be Real Talks. I'm the host of this show. My name is Sophia Givre. And what we're going to be doing on here is I'm going to be interviewing alum, faculty, staff, students, various employers, and we're going to be having real, honest conversations about navigating the workplace, different workplace dynamics and challenges, and how they're really related to different aspects of people's identities. So we are going to be talking with people about challenges that they faced in the hopes that students can really get concrete career advice. So when they're in similar spaces, they are able to advocate for themselves, whether it be in internship settings, whether it be in the workplace, because they have that solid advice from people who really relate to experiences that they're either going through or going to experience later on. I will be talking to some people about diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts at some points and how they've been able to elevate them in their position, or maybe how it speaks to the larger mission of the company that they're working for. But generally, the advice for this show and the intention of this show is that everybody is an expert in their own personal and professional experience. Everybody has something to contribute, something of value, and it's going to be a really great learning opportunity for our students like yourselves who are watching. So my first guest today is Josue Quinones, also known as JQ. He has a master's in social work that he received in 2012. He is a mental health advocate, a motivational rapper. He is the founder of Success is a Lifestyle and an academic counselor. JQ is also the product of the Educational Opportunity Program, so he is really motivated and focused on helping students who find themselves in similar positions meet that success and offer that really tailored advice. So I am very, very happy to have JQ with us here today. He is pretty much the embodiment of what I'm trying to do with this show. And it is going to be theme-based. So for today, we are going to be focusing on what it's like to work in predominantly white spaces. So I'm just going to get started, JQ. I know you have a lot of insight to offer us here. So just to start off, what has your experience of working in predominantly white institutions been like so far?
So that's a great question. Thank you for that awesome introduction, Sophia, because that was good. I was like, I don't know if I could have done it better myself. What has my experience truly has been quite interesting. And ironically, when I hear that question and when I think about it, the first thing that I go to is my experience as a resident director. Um, because I remember it wasn't until I got into that position where I believe that I started to recognize that I was in a predominantly white space and started to have experiences that, for lack of better words, consistently reminded me of that. And so I remember the ones that stand out, or the one that truly stands out, was there was an evening after work, right? As a resident director, you live where you work. And so I was waiting for one of my friends to come by and pick me up so we can go to the gym. So I'm not dressed in, my regular daytime attire, shirt, slacks, shoes. I had on a pair of Nike windbreakers and a Nike sweater, and I think I had a skull cap on with some sneakers. And I stopped in the RA office to hang out with some of my student staff. I figured while I'm waiting, just check in, see how they're doing, engage with them. And there was a resident who was in the office, and they turned to me and said, "Oh, you look super thugged out." And I was like, um, "What do you mean?" "Oh, well, you look super thugged out." And I was like, I don't understand what you mean by that. "Oh, come on, well, And I was like, sorry, I don't, right? But it was just that experience of like, what does that mean? What is your interpretation? What does it mean to be a thug? What is it about my attire that communicates thug to you in some way, shape, or form? And knowing that I'm the resident director of this building, and so I've had experiences like that. I've had experiences where student staff would address me in a way that they wouldn't have otherwise, and it was simply based on my attire. And so that was something that actually, for me, um, I sort of became more aware of than I thought I would. Just having to be mindful of my attire, and I think the live-in position sort of played into that, right? Because I live where I work, and so I guess perhaps for some students it's hard to make that differentiation to some degree, but at the same time, I felt like it sort of plays into this larger theme, right, of assumptions that we may make based on our experiences, what we observe, what we've been taught. And so those are just a few experiences that I've noticed, that have been pretty unique and to some extent frustrating and difficult to sort of navigate, because in those moments you have to choose how you respond, right? And the way in which you respond can create certain outcomes. And what is the outcome that you want? How can you educate? How can you teach? How can I also honor my emotion and my frustration in that moment, right? And so being very tactical, I think, is the word I would use. Being very strategic about how you respond in those circumstances. So it's been quite interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I think you really highlight how, despite the power dynamics, right? You say yourself, you're a resident director in this space, but still, because of your ethnicity, because of your skin color, people have this assumption, right, that you're quote unquote thugged out when you're not wearing the appropriate clothing. So it really gets at, in order for someone to avoid those microaggressions, they have to constantly be monitoring themselves and how taxing, that really can be on a person for sure. But it sounds like you have developed some helpful kind of coping mechanisms with it and strategies around it. Can you tell some of our students, well, I do want to preface this with, obviously, black and brown people are not a monolith, right? So there's much diversity within these communities. But
Absolutely.
in thinking of kind of these general tips, what would you say to students who are navigating these predominantly white spaces? How can they effectively deal with it?
Ooh, it's a loaded question. Just because there's so many variables that are at play in those spaces. And so, every space is gonna look different, it's gonna feel different, and based on your own individual identity and how you present or how you're perceived, that it's so unpredictable, right? There's no like catch all phrase. And so, at least from my own experiences, I think what I could share is trying to find your allies as best as you can, I think is important, right? Because I think in those spaces, if you have allies who can help and support you, you got to find that. Like, that's crucial, right? To be in those spaces. I mean, to be in those spaces alone, it's draining, it's taxing, and it's detrimental to your own mental, emotional, spiritual wellness, which then affects your physical wellness, which, right? And so I think having a support network in those spaces, if you can, and if you can't have one in those spaces, then having it outside of those spaces is going to be crucial. Because that's, I think, the most important piece is having folks that understand you, understand your experience, and can help you navigate and sort of cope and vent when you need to and get it out, so that you're not doing it in those spaces where you probably won't be heard or can further, perpetuate this false narrative that they already have in their head about you. Um, so I think that's one of them. I think the other one for me would be, um, being yourself fully and truly. You have to maintain your own authenticity and you have to stay true to yourself, because how else do people know the truth, right? If you're constantly shape shifting to fit whatever form they're going to want and receive. Um, at the same time, also being cognizant of how do I express my true and authentic self in a way that they will understand, right? And that's there's so many layers to that I probably can't even fully break down. um but that's another one that I would say. I think really reading the room, that's something that I've always done. I think in regardless of whether it's predominantly white or not, I think in every space, that's something that I've done, is just read the room, right? Pay attention to what people are saying, but also more importantly, pay attention to what people are not saying, because sometimes there's a message in what they don't say. And so paying attention to those things as well, and just again not losing yourself in that. you know, because I think during my experiences, I think that's one of the things that I didn't do was like I stayed true to myself, and I went towards my supports countless times to get that initial vent sometimes, right? Especially when it causes anger, it causes frustration. I'm calling somebody. I'm like, look, listen, I need to just share this experience with you because this happened to me and I can't believe this, right? And trying my best in the moment to create a teachable moment if possible. I know sometimes that's not always the easiest thing for me to do in the moment, right? Like the example I shared earlier, I probably could have done some education around that, right? But I think I was so frustrated and couldn't believe what I was just going through that I just posed the questions and was like, I'm gonna leave you to think about that. And hopefully you'll think about that. Whether they did or not, I don't really know. But I thought for me, it was more important to maintain my composure as opposed to, again, perpetuate a false narrative that they might have, you know, and yeah, just kind of that's a lot. It's a loaded question, but those are the few things that kind of stick out to me with regard to that.
Yeah, and I think your answer demonstrates how it's a loaded question, right? The complexities of it, right? It's like depending on the situation, are you safe in that kind of space to say something, right? And then also thinking about how you're reacting emotionally to it. Are you in a place where I think it's important for you to say, right? It's not everybody's job to educate others on that stuff, right? If you're not in a place there, then that's not on you. So I'm glad that you really kind of highlighted that. And then, of course, finding those allies and people that understand. So I think sometimes there can be a little bit of misunderstanding around why that takes place from people. But hearing from you, I'm glad that you can really solidify to students, right, that it is important to have communities that share those similar experiences as you, because it's a support that isn't always offered from communities that don't understand the experience, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I think that makes me think of the book Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the
I was
Cafeteria?
thinking of that book, JQ. I was going to be like, for all those students out there, read this book, but they
Yeah,
probably already understand it without the book. But sorry, go
yeah,
ahead.
well, and no, I think it's interesting, right? Because that book comes to mind, and what it made me think of was how many times, at least from my own experience, where I've sat with my own community, right? And I didn't understand what that really was. It was just normal. It was like, this is what I do. And it wasn't until I read that book and started to really analyze some of my experiences, especially having attended a predominantly white institution, where I was like, oh, I get why I do this. Like, because it's a need, right? And that's not to say that we shouldn't branch out and be more inclusive in our social groups or social circles or professional circles, whatever you want to call them. But that is needed, that sense of support, that sense of belonging, right? Like Dr. Terrell Strayhorn, one of my mentors, says, right? Belonging is such a crucial part of life and success and education and everything. And so, it's important for us to have those groups.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is a good segue to another question I have for you. So we kind of talked about the advice for students. If
Mhm.
you wave a magic wand, if you could talk to higher ed, some administrators in higher ed, how do you feel that they can help marginalized communities feel more included on campus?
I think first and foremost for me, representation has always been the go-to, first and foremost. And I think part of that is rooted in my own experience, right? It wasn't until I saw someone who I identified with, who looked like me, who spoke like me, who perhaps had a similar, it didn't have to be exact, but similar experience to me, that I was able to one, feel comfortable, and then two, even be able to imagine something for myself, right? And so to see someone who looked like me doing something that perhaps I hadn't envisioned before, because I never saw someone doing it, does a lot for a student, for any human being, really. And so I think that would be the first and foremost, is to really ensure that there is equal representation spread across the board. I can't think about how many institutions don't necessarily have that. Having been a part of departments or teams that perhaps didn't have that reflected in the staff, and So yeah, I think representation is so big, because we see ourselves in other people and other people see themselves in us, right? And so having someone that looks like me, talks like me, and not to the T, right? Because no one's gonna be exactly like you, right? But it's just that does so much of what we experience, so much of what we go through is a visual, a auditory, a physical. It's all those experiences tie together. And so when you have someone who looks like you, first and foremost, it's like, oh, okay. And then you begin to learn about them, and then that's when you decide whether or not you can actually connect with them. But there has to be some sort of representation so that you feel seen, you feel heard. And so that I think would be the magic wand, is like get people here that look like me and understand my experiences. And that's hard. Like that's not easy, but it's needed. And just because it's hard doesn't mean we shouldn't do it.
Yeah, for sure. And then kind of building on that, right? I would say that that's like the first step, right? Is having people that look like have that equal representation, but also really listening to those opinions and making sure that when we're looking at different cabinets or different higher level positions, what do those individuals look like, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And something else that came to mind too is like really vetting people. I just because I think about how much of this work is it's layered, right? And at least for me, I think some of it definitely is individual work in terms of looking at yourself. Like we all have to look at ourselves and understand our own experience, right? Like what has shaped the way that I look at the world and the way that I walk through it, the way that I perceive it. What are those things? Because some of those things may not necessarily be correct. They may be biased. They are biased, right? And so what are they? How is it that my experience um doesn't allow me to understand the experience of someone else? What's that barrier? What's blocking that? Right? And how can I begin to cross that threshold and enter into someone's world? And while I may not have had that experience, I can empathize with it. I can understand it. I can believe it to be true, as opposed to writing it off as, oh, you're just making this up. Like something's wrong with you and the way you're thinking. You shouldn't think that way. Well, there's a reason why I think that way. Right? Why do you think the way that you do? There's a reason you think that way. How about we talk about that? Right? So, it's very layered, but I guess vetting people to really dig into, and push them, encourage them to really give their true self, right? Because I'm getting on a soapbox now, but I feel like sometimes a lot of things are performative, right? They're very performative. They're not very genuine, and it's hard to cut through that. But I think it's necessary. You got to cut through the noise. Cut through the noise and the fluff. Like, just be honest with me. I'd rather you be honest and truthful than for me to find out something later on. Because now I'm gonna be really more upset, right? Because I feel like you sold me this lie. So yeah, so that's something else that I think comes to mind for me.
Yeah, exactly. And also to re-emphasize, you did say it, but with students, right? That's another thing that I think is really important. And it depends obviously on where you're coming from and your background. But for me, as a first gen, I really, really struggled with trying to assimilate right into, okay, I'm observing what other people are doing. Is this how I'm supposed to act? Right. And then it took years where I'm like, this just doesn't seem right. Like, I'm just going to be myself, a more like polished version, I guess, like you were saying, obviously in professional settings, but it's so, so important because I think that will allow people to stand out. And then looking at higher ed, that really allows those kind of diverse voices and levels of inclusion to take place.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We need space for the voices, right? We
Mhm.
can't just invite them. We have to actually create space for those voices to exist and to live and to flourish. So, yeah.
Yep, yep. And then looking at your field of academic counseling and advising,
Mhm.
what are some of the experiences that you had or advice that you could think of why it's so important and impactful to have equal representation within that field?
Yeah. So it's interesting because as you first posed the question, I was like, wow, coming from the institution and doing the advising I was doing previously to what I'm doing now is so different, right? So I was at, a predominantly white institution that had, it was a 4-year school. It had students who lived on campus and lived off campus, but now I'm at a community college and the population there is so different. And I love it, right? I love that. And so to your question, I think it's so important to have that representation, because even for myself, if I'm being wholeheartedly transparent, there's students that I speak to who have experiences that I haven't. It's so hard for me to relate to, and I have to really like dig into myself and figure out like how can I connect with them in a way that doesn't write them off, in a way that doesn't minimize their experience, and in a way that is true and genuine. And that's hard. It's hard work, right? Like when I'm talking to a student who has children and just lost their job and still wants to go to school but is struggling with unemployment, and like all these different layers, and to be honest, I don't have no clue, right? It's like, how do I bring myself to a space where I can put myself in their shoes to some extent and help them in the best way possible, and not, or who can I point them to, right? That, because I don't always have to do it. It doesn't have to be me. It's like, look, listen, I'm gonna be honest. I don't know. It sounds very difficult, but I think this person is gonna be able to help you with where you are, right? And so that's also why it's important, because while I may be the person, the first point of contact, I might not be the one to have the solution, or I might not be the one that has the experience or the ability to help them. But if we have that representation, if we have that diversity, we have that inclusivity, I could potentially point them to the person that may be able to help them. Or I may reach out to that person and, later on and say, hey, look, I have this student and I thought of you. You came to mind, and we also have to dig into that piece too of like, well, why did you think of me, right? Which is another layer that I have to acknowledge and be honest about, right? But you know, but having that matters and developing genuine relationships with those folks allows for that seamless transition to be able to support students in the way that they need. And so I don't even know if I'm on your question anymore, but I think it's in those experiences, right? Where like I don't fully understand how to help them. I don't have that experience. I don't know what it's like. And so who can I connect them to that could potentially help them, right? Or who can I go to and say, hey, look, I got this student and I don't know how to help them, X, Y. And then that person can educate me, and give me some insight of like, hey, here's what they may be going through. Here's what you may want to explore with them. Here's what you may want to talk with them about. And so I think it just creates an opportunity and environment for people and students to get served in the ways that they truly need.
Yeah, that definitely answers the question, right? It's like having that equal representation. You have a whole network of individuals that you can reach out to that have those diverse experiences and can really speak to a variety of different students, variety of different needs.
Yeah, yeah, because it was so layered, it was so complex, and so we need that. We need we need layers within our staff and within our representation and administration to be able to serve the layers of students that we serve. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then my last question for you today is, this is a heavy one, JQ. But
She's prepping me. Yeah.
But so I kind of think of this period as a reckoning kind of period, right? Where we are constantly being exposed to these
Mm,
images that demonstrate police
mm,
brutality, that demonstrate these overt racist acts. We can think of them as the Karen videos, right?
yeah.
Um, and while that is good and society needs to at large kind of be aware that this has always been going on,
Right.
I think it's also important to note that that is traumatic. That is very damaging. That's
Mhm,
difficult
mhm,
for
mhm,
individuals who, students of color who see these images and
mhm,
constantly seeing someone who looks like you
mhm,
having these experiences.
mhm.
So I know that you are a motivational speaker, and what do you have for the students that are feeling down, right? Maybe they're not that optimistic about jobs or going back to college. How can you motivate them in these times?
Yeah, yeah. So I think the first part of that, would certainly be in regards to a lot of the imagery that we're seeing in the media, on social media, on television, or however we're consuming information. I think it's being a little mindful of how much of that we're consuming, because I don't think that we should not be informed, but I also believe that we have to be attentive to our mental, emotional, and spiritual self, right? Because that feeds our mental, emotional, and spiritual selves. and that communicates a message to us, and what is that communicating to us, and is that healthy, and to what extent do I need to step away from it briefly so that I can recompose myself and then jump back into, the so-called fight, for lack of a better word. And so I think that that's crucial. Definitely keep yourself informed, but also try to limit how much of that you're consuming on a consistent basis for your own, mental, emotional, spiritual sanity. But then also figure out how because sometimes that can be overwhelming in terms of figuring out, well, what do I do? Well, what's my role? Right. And I think that comes down to, well, who are you, and what do you want your role to be, and how can you, contribute in your own way that's true to yourself again. And so again, there's a lot of layers to it, but I think that would be the first. It's just being mindful of how much of that you're consuming, because it can have a negative impact on you. And so you want to be mindful of that. I think also, just again, leaning on your support systems, I think, is important, right? Because we're all going through this together, and so it's together that we'll get through this. You shouldn't feel like you're alone. You shouldn't feel like it's just you. There's a whole community of people that are going through it in the same way or similar ways as you. And so I think leaning on those support systems is absolutely crucial, and knowing that we've made it this far for a reason, and so we can't give up. Right? We could take some time away to recollect, and then we jump right back in. And knowing that we're not jumping in alone, we're in this together, I think is absolutely crucial. I feel like I'm missing another part of your question.
It was basically how to get students encouraged, right? So we got the coping.
Yeah. So, I think it's, again, leaning on those networks, recognizing that there are people who want to help us in whatever stage of life that we're in. If we're a student and we're struggling with school and classes because of what's going on around us, or what's happening in the respective place that we're attending school. If we're almost on our way out and we're entering the job market, there's other people who are in a similar situation, but there's also people that are probably waiting to help you. And so it's a matter of getting connected to those folks as well. I think, at least for me, the biggest piece during this whole time is establishing, fostering, and building your community. Because especially in the times that we are now, it's so easy, at least from my vantage point, for people to feel isolated and alone. But we don't have to necessarily feel that way. And if you are feeling that way, let someone in. Let someone in. Invite someone in. I tell folks, check on your strong friends, right? Because sometimes those are the same folks that are giving so much to everybody else, but no one's necessarily pouring into them because they think that they're good, right? And so, yeah, it's just crucial to lean on one another, and to take inventory of yourself. How are you feeling? What are you feeling? Why are you feeling that? What is that doing? And how do I heal from that? How do I work with that? How do I cope with that in a way that isn't further destructive? Um, yeah, those are the pieces of advice that I would give. And what kind of lane are you creating for yourself as well? Because I think that's also important, is everybody plays a role. And so what's your role? How is it true to you? And how does it help you? And being empathetic to others as well, right? Because I think sometimes in these climates and in these times, we may put a lot on other people, like, you should be doing this, you should be doing that, this is how you should be. But we don't know what they're going through, and we don't know, they may be uneducated and feel unprepared. And so how do we support them so that they can feel prepared? Yeah.
Nice.
That was a loaded one.
That was great. Great advice for our students. As always, JQ, love it. So I look forward to continuing these conversations on and off screen with you. I hope for all the students that are watching out there, you've gained some insight from JQ. You have some advice. He is an alum of Binghamton. Try to connect with him and all of that stuff. And I will see you on the next episode.